Everyone, this is the final week of school for this year. I'm gonna be kind of cramming in, I don't know, the last like four chapters in hopefully a half hour. Um, but yeah, no real work this week. If you'd be willing to take the survey that I laid out, um, I I'd appreciate it. It's going to be kept anonymous. Your email address won't be kept on there. Um, so if you could do that, tell me how you like the course, especially before the online learning part, and we can hit that up. I don't know if anyone will watch this. This is going to be rambling about history for a half hour, but if you are, shoot me an email. Let me know that you watched it, I guess. I don't know. You probably don't need bonus points or anything, so I'll send you an e-card uh, if you watch this. But I do want to finish the course, and at least give you kind of a rundown of the rest of U.S. history. I think is important. We kind of left off a couple big things that I want to hit on. The civil rights movement is definitely an important aspect of the 50s into the 60s, where we see segregation come to a head. Brown v. Board of Education, that Supreme Court case challenged the old Plessy v. Ferguson court case, and we start to see African Americans really challenge the status quo in many ways. And the start of the civil rights movement is often debated of what it is. Personally, I think that the death of Emmett Till is kind of the start of the civil rights movement. And Emmett Till was a young boy, young teenager who was brutally murdered, tortured, and then murdered for flirting with a young white woman, which was actually, we learned decades later that was false, that she lied about it to her husband, and him and his brother-in-law killed Emmett Till in Mississippi. Emmett Till was from Chicago, visiting family, and so his body was sent back to his mom in Chicago, and she had an open casket funeral. And so there's press photos of his corpse that was it was a lynching. It's completely grotesque, and if the nation kind of saw, whoa, this is what is happening. And then within a few months, Rosa Parks is arrested on a bus. I feel like that's kind of the start, that you start to really get that feel. And then Rosa Parks often is considered the start of the movement. Now, Rosa Parks it was planted there. She was a part of the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was the civil rights group led by Martin Luther King Jr., nonviolent protest. They wanted kind of a splash protest, and Rosa Parks was kind of handpicked, an older woman, looked very non-threatening. So she, taking the bus back from her work, sat in the white section, which usually was allowed, actually, unless it was full. Ended up being full. She got challenged. Ended up being arrested. So that's kind of one of the main groups, the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King Jr. It's probably what most of us think of when we think of civil rights movement, nonviolent protests, singing in the street. Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream speech, right? March on Washington, all of that. You combine that with Brown v. Board of Education. The lawyer in that case was Thurgood Marshall, who ended up being the first Supreme Court justice who is of color. And, he was the lawyer that argued that case. And it's going to lead to kind of the first high school that is kind of desegregated, Little Rock 9. In Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 students volunteer. And I would get much more into all this. There's a lot of good stuff here with more time. Some of the other groups that you had, SNCC, SNCC, was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Their job was kind of coordinating. They were branches on college campuses, and their job was kind of coordinating these protests, helping, getting people out of prison, things like that. So they were big in a couple different protests. Sit-ins was a big one. Lunch counters, whether it be at diners or at department stores, were segregated. Go in, college students sit at these lunch counters just to ask to be served. They wouldn't get served. They would sit there for the whole day until they were forced out or arrested. Oftentimes, be met with violence. People spitting in their face. The worst example I ever read was a pot of boiling coffee thrown into a young man's face and SNCC. And then those students are the ones that get arrested. You get violently punched, beaten, hot coffee thrown in your face. You get arrested. Then the next day they go back. They do it again. Someone else will be sitting there. Right? It's a different group of people will be sitting there from SNCC. So this was consistent. That was what the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King Jr.'s group especially, as well as SNCC, kind of combined to, that's kind of what it was we're going to get deemed the bad guy, but we're going to turn the other cheek. We're not going to meet them with violence. And eventually that's going to win out because we're going to be persistent. We're not going to stop. I think sometimes we think of the Civil Rights Movement, we think of nonviolent protest, and we think of, it took a little bit of time. And this took almost 20 years in some senses since World War II. So it was a long, persistent journey. And I think sometimes a lot of protests today that we look at, some of the things that the nonviolent sect of the Civil Rights Movement did was to disrupt the public, right? So I think one of those things that always gets argued is, should protesters be in the street? Should they be blocking traffic? That was something that the SCLC did. They blocked traffic. They stood in the street. That's nonviolent protest. No one. You're not hurting anyone, right? Maybe someone can't get to work on time. That's an inconvenience. That's bad for them. But you're not hurting them, right? It's not violence. One of the other protests that SNCC did was the Freedom Rides. They actually would ride buses into the South, into areas that had laws set up for buses had to be segregated. Just ride the streets, right? Nonviolent. Oftentimes they would get stopped. Violence would happen. Molotov cocktails thrown in the window. People beat up. Get another bus. Do it again the next day, right? So, kind of as we start to see colleges, universities, schools get desegregated, kind of a reverse protest that happened was at Ole Miss, University of Mississippi. They had been the first black student, James Meredith, who was an older student. He had been in the military and was admitted. And the president of the university was kind of waffling about it. There's actually a protest from, white kind of anti civil rights protesters, and the Green Berets were sent in. John F. Kennedy was president. It was kind of a big deal. They eventually arrested, and that's kind of put out. Obviously, the March on Washington that happened, the I Have a Dream speech, and all of that. This would eventually, in the 60s, the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and John F. Kennedy's death was one of the reasons this was passed. Lyndon Johnson used his death to say, hey, this is something that John F. Kennedy supported. We need to pass it, and we did. On the other side was kind of the violent sect. Malcolm X was... one of his slogans was the ballot, give us the ballot or the bullet, right? So either we get the right to vote or you get shot. Armed self-resistance was his philosophy, would lead to the Black Panthers later, that, wear AK-47s on their hip and walk down the street. And, that's when there started to be a lot of restrictions placed on guns and weapons and open carry, because the Black Panthers were kind of an armed group. So there's the other side. Much more to go into than 8 minutes, but there's a little bit of it. So let's talk about Vietnam. Vietnam was a long war, kind of similar to the Korean War in that the north part of Vietnam was communist, the south was not. And Vietnam, kind of how it starts. After World War II, Vietnam, Vietnam is a place, let me start here. Vietnam is a place that's always been kind of a colony of someone else. China, then Japan, and then after World War II was given to France. when Japan lost. So France is kind of controlling this area, some decent resources. It's nothing super special in terms of a colony. So as you are against any colonial kind of empire, you want to fight back. And the guy that fights back, his name's Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh actually wants, he reads the Declaration of Independence to his supporters. He wants to be like America. He actually comes to us and asks for help. Well, we're good friends with the French. We're not going to kick them out. We're not going to fight them. No. Well, who's going to turn to? The Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union is going to say, hey, as long as you're communist, we will back you. We'll finance you. China will help. Boom. We're in. Sweeps through northern Vietnam. Containment. We got to keep it contained. We got to try to get rid of it. And even though containment isn't getting rid of the problem, we need to contain it where it is. That's an issue. So with it spreading into Vietnam. So at first, under Dwight Eisenhower, under John F. Kennedy, we're just going to send advisors. We're going to help out the French, send some supplies, send some advisors, try to train the South Vietnamese to fight against the North Vietnamese. And then there's a battle called the Dien Bien Phu, where the French get kind of crushed, and France kind of like, screw this. We don't need this country. We're out. And now America's left. We're just kind of stuck there. So we have these advisors. It's kind of escalating. It's in the national eye, but it's not a full-scale war. We're not the ones fighting yet. And then Lyndon Johnson takes over as president. John F. Kennedy is killed. There's a lot of thoughts maybe he wanted to de-escalate Vietnam. He wanted to get us out of there like the French left. And Lyndon Johnson, as vice president, wanted to escalate. And so an incident happens called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And as we've talked about before, right, a ship gets sunk and everyone goes crazy. So we had a ship in the Gulf of Tonkin Bay, which is along North Vietnam. And Lyndon Johnson comes out and says, hey, our ship got shot at. And, we fire back. They're attacking us, not just the South Vietnamese. We have to get involved. 2 days later, Lyndon Johnson comes out and says, they attacked us again. Attack another ship. We'll learn much later after the fact, decades after the fact, that was all a lie. Maybe the Gulf of Tonkin incident happened. We probably fired first, and they were retaliating. That the 2 days later thing didn't even exist. The ship wasn't even there. This was a kind of a precursor to get into Vietnam. Congress gets upset. Communists are coming after us. And we pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, gives the president full power. Do whatever you want. LBJ, you can send troops. You can have the draft. You can do whatever you want. Stop them communists. And he does. We're going to start the draft. It's going to be massive. We're going to send ground troops. We're going to fight the Vietnamese. People at home, not a big fan of the draft. A lot of people didn't know most people didn't know what Vietnam is. Most people still don't. And why are we sending young Americans to go fight over there? Stop the communists. They're not really doing anything to us. It's really not that close. So there was a big counterculture push against it. The big problem with the Vietnam War, because we probably would have been fine, was most of the South Vietnamese, they didn't want us there either. They felt like we were imperialists that were kind of controlling them. And so there becomes kind of this counter push against Americans in South Vietnam. They're called the Viet Cong. 90% of our time was spent fighting our own side. We were fighting against the Viet Cong. We were fighting against the South Vietnamese. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the North Vietnam, was very smart. And he actually built what was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a trail through Cambodia and Laos, countries next to Vietnam, through the jungle, and to get supplies to the Viet Cong. 'Cause he knew if they fought us, he wouldn't have to fight us. That would be it. That would be all our time. And for American soldiers, many of whom were drafted to go there, this was very tense because you didn't know who the Viet Cong were. They didn't have uniforms. They're farmers, who are fighting against Americans. You might walk past a farming village. You don't know who's with you or against you. A guy might pull out a rocket launcher and blow up your platoon. That's scary. The other thing was, ever since World War II, a lot of the South Vietnamese people had started to dig and build an underground tunnel system. And this tunnel system was going to be used against the French. Now it's used against us. So they could kind of crawl underground, had beds, had medical equipment, had guns and rifles. So Operation Oregon, we actually were trying to root out these underground tunnels. And they started placing traps, and it got really messy. It was just a disaster because you were fighting our own side. Every time Lyndon Johnson, oh, we're almost done, we're gonna win, whatever, and we weren't really close. A couple quick hits with Vietnam. The Tet Offensive was the New Year of Tet, basically our New Year, Vietnamese New Year. We had a ceasefire. The Viet Cong and Ho Chi Minh, the North Vietnamese, launch an all-out attack. We actually win. We defend ourselves well, but on TV, all America sees us. Oh, we almost have us won. We're getting attacked 100 different places. That doesn't look good. So, that's not so good. We'll see an event within the United States also take a turn. We see a lot of protests happen against Vietnam, and Lyndon Johnson will not run for re-election, and Richard Nixon is going to be the guy that wins. And he's going to talk about getting us out of Vietnam, because that was pretty popular. But he knows to get us out of there, he has to get rid of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So he starts bombing Laos and Cambodia. So it looks like the president's like, hey, I want to get elected. I'm going to leave. He gets in office, I'm going to bomb more countries. That doesn't look good. So there's a protest at Kent State University in Ohio, and the National Guard is called in by the governor, and the National Guard actually ends up firing at the students. 4 students are killed. One of them from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She's buried in Squirrel Hill. 2 of them weren't even a part of the protest. One was in the ROTC, was in the training to become an officer in the military. So people were like, whoa, now this violence is spilling over in our university, Jackson State, Mississippi. The National Guard called in, 2 black students are killed. I mean, this is getting bad. So Richard Nixon actually does start to de-escalate Vietnam, and eventually it'll end. We're just going to leave, and South Vietnam within a few months will be gone. All Vietnam will be communist. They're still communist. Guess what? It didn't spread here. It's not. We technically didn't lose. We just left, but that was that. So let me talk about Richard Nixon as president, because he actually did some good things. Remember, we talked about him last week as VP, running for VP, taking bribes. Foreign affairs wise, he gave an olive branch to China a bit, started to reach out some of these communist countries, but he was not a good person, and he was obsessed with winning. So when he ran for re-election, he was going to win. It was in the bag. He ends up winning, I think, 49 states. I mean, he ends up crushing for re-election. But he wants everything he can get. So his re-election campaign, which was nicknamed Creep, they did a lot of kind of secret ops, illegal things to secure the election. And one of the things that they did was broke into the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., which was the Democrats' headquarters. And they stole some documents, copied some things. They ended up getting caught because they actually put duct tape on the door so it wouldn't lock. A night guard saw it, thought the cleaning crew just put tape on the door, which they did at times. He took it off, came back around, it's back on magically. Something's wrong, call the police. They get arrested. So these criminals get arrested. Would be fine. But it's because the Democratic headquarters was there, the FBI is supposed to investigate. Richard Nixon finds out, oh, that was us. Asks the FBI not to investigate. First big mistake. And, this is going to kind of spiral out of control. There's a couple reporters, the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein, that stay on this story. It was page 5 news. It wasn't big news. They stay on it and connect it to the White House and to the campaign for Richard Nixon. Ultimately, what does him in, and another thing, I would go much more in detail in class. One thing that does him in is he actually recorded every conversation he had in the Oval Office. He had tape recorders that his secretary set for his memoirs after he was done being president. He was going to write best-selling memoirs and make a ton of money. Congress says, we want to listen to that. The investigators say, we want to listen to that. He says, no, they're mine. And that goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says you got to turn him over. He says, okay. And the tapes were turned over. One of them was missing a big chunk of time. Right after Watergate happened, there's enough on the tapes to incriminate him that he found out about it, try to cover it up. and he would have been removed from office. He ended up resigning before he was impeached and left. So that's Richard Nixon. He ends up leaving. Gerald Ford becomes president because Nixon's vice president at the time. He actually had some bribery scandal. He ended up resigning before. And so Gerald Ford becomes the first unelected president of the United States. No one elected him. He was the Speaker of the House from Michigan. So Speaker of the House of the U.S. Congress, but he was from Michigan. Only the people in his district actually voted for him. He becomes president. Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, I'm not going to go too far into their presidencies and their politics. It was definitely kind of a rocky time. We're kind of moving forward in the Cold War a bit, and economically not so good. So Gerald Ford, Republican, kind of takes over. He ends up pardoning Richard Nixon. So Richard Nixon could not be convicted of any crimes with Watergate. People didn't like that. He doesn't get reelected. Jimmy Carter, peanut farmer from Georgia, had political experience, ends up being elected. Very liberal Democrat, very intelligent guy, but just not kind of fitting for the job. And so he ends up losing, and Ronald Reagan ends up taking over. Ronald Reagan was a former Hollywood actor, turned Republican, and he's going to have a big economics program that the Republican Party still is kind of their platform of economics. It's called Reaganomics, and basically the basic tenets of it are you're going to cut spending, so that's going to help you. It's going to get some money. You're going to use that money to cut taxes, and then you're going to increase the budget of the military. So it actually costs money and ends up raising the deficit pretty high. But it does help fix a bad economic time. And then, on the flip side, in the second term, Ronald Reagan's going to have to raise taxes again. This becomes an issue later with his vice president. I'll come back to that. So during Reagan's term, kind of cleaning up the Cold War, it's coming to an end. He calls on Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, to tear down the Berlin Wall in Germany. It'll happen, and Germany will be united. Soviet Union will give up their claim on that. There's a lot of countries in Latin America we get involved with, Nicaragua, and try to root out communism there. There's a big, the Iran-Contra Affair, a big scandal where Ronald Reagan's administration broke multiple laws, selling weapons to the Contras in Nicaragua. We're an anti-communist group, but we're drug trafficking in the United States. Congress said, we're not going to help them anymore. He kept helping them, and ended up having kind of an issue with Iran that I'd like to hit on. I mean, we got a little bit of time. Iran is a country that was actually decently liberal in terms of in terms of social status for the Middle East. And a lot of people in Iran wanted a more religious-based government based on Islam. And so there was the Iranian Revolution happens, and this kind of religious government takes over. And one of the things that happens is they try to root out the Western powers. And so they end up kidnapping a number of Americans that were in the Iranian consulate when Jimmy Carter was president. Jimmy Carter couldn't get them released. Ronald Reagan takes office, they're almost immediately released. So it kind of builds this relationship with Iran. So we actually start selling weapons to Iran to finance the Contras, which was also illegal without congressional approval. It was kind of an issue. Reagan's vice president was George H.W. Bush. And he gets elected on the back of Ronald Reagan, very popular president. One of the things that he gets asked is, hey, were you going to raise taxes as president? He says, read my lips, no new taxes. He gets elected. He ends up raising taxes. We have one conflict during his presidency. I won't get super into it, but it's the Persian Gulf War, also known as Operation Desert Storm, where we actually stopped Saddam Hussein, who in Iraq, who had invaded Kuwait, tried to take their oil fields. Very successful. We got rid of him. He ends up staying in Iraq, staying leader of Iraq, though. And that'll become some problems later. George H.W. Bush will lose re-election to Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was kind of a moderate Democrat and very, very cool, younger, guy, played saxophone on the Arsenio Hall show, was very popular. He ends up taking over and works with a Republican-led Congress in many ways to cut spending and kind of balance the budget. He'll be the first president in 30 years to have a surplus for one of the years that he's president. But he's going to get impeached, right? So that's kind of what Bill Clinton's remembered for. He was accused of a bunch of things, of scandals as governor of Arkansas and then as president. One of those was that he sexually harassed an employee of his, and he was the governor of Arkansas, and he was deposed for that lawsuit. One of the questions asked was he having an affair with a former White House intern, Monica Lewinsky. He said no, he did not have any sexual relations with her, and that was that. Well, he was, and so it ends up getting found out. I won't go into the details too much, but he lied under oath. That's perjury, and legally he didn't. He kind of got out of that by the definition of sexual relations in that court case was sex, was intercourse, and he did not have intercourse with her. So legally he was fine, but people felt like he lied, right? And that's not something you should do as president. So it's kind of Republican against Democrat, fighting what should this level be. He gets impeached. His popularity actually goes up during the impeachment, but it was a really big event. He's not removed from office. They don't get a majority. And he finished out his term. Who it actually ends up hurting, because that happened during his second term, was his vice president, Al Gore. Nothing to do with the impeachment at all. Nothing to do with the affair or anything. But in the 2000 election, he is up against George W. Bush, which is George H.W. Bush's son. And this becomes the closest election in U.S. history. Only 10,000 or so votes in Florida decide who is president. The electoral vote is that close. Al Gore wins the popular vote. And the governor of Florida is the one in charge of counting the votes. The governor, Jeb Bush, is the brother of George W. Bush. And so it goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says the first count in Florida counts. George W. Bush wins. Al Gore never becomes president. George W. Bush served 2 terms. 9/11 happened during his administration, and he's going to lead the charge for the war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? So Afghanistan kind of made sense. They were housing Al-Qaeda, who led the attack, even though most of the attackers were from Saudi Arabia. That was that. The war in Iraq had to do with Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11, but he had caused issues in the past, and there was thoughts that he had weapons of mass destruction, that he had some type of, not nuclear weapons, but major weapons. We find out he did not. When we ended up capturing him and searching the country, we never found evidence of weapons of mass destruction. He was put to death, but that was kind of George W. Bush's presidency. We know Barack Obama will win the last 8 years, and then Donald Trump the last 4. We'll see what happens this year. But Donald Trump was impeached as well, which makes for 3 in our course: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. But I'm going to leave it there. Obviously, if we had this class instead of 30 minutes, we'd be spending weeks and weeks. But I hope that the course went well. I hope that the school year went well for you. I'd appreciate if you could take the survey on the course, tell me what you liked, what you didn't like, before the online learning stuff. And I'd appreciate it. And we'll hopefully I'll talk to you soon and see everyone in the fall.